Hello, everyone. Nice to see everyone again. Welcome to Proc-n-Roll, your guide to practical procurement, where we make procurement rock and roll. As ever, I've got Natasha, our pro CPO, got Conrad, the innovator, and you've got myself, Zach, your expert on all things procurement, and we join you with over 70 years of practical procurement experience. So let's jump into today's discussion. It's a very topical one. About risk management. We finished our last episode discussing how risks are showing up on the business radar. Procurement is being asked to do more and more when it comes to risk management. And yet, procurement and businesses are also facing a rapidly changing landscape in 2025. And companies need to be aware of all the risks that can impact their operations, can impact their profitability and their long-term sustainability. So definitely procurement plays a crucial role and managing those risks and mitigating those risks. So let's jump right in. I'd like to start out by asking you, Natasha, Conrad, what types of risks you think there are in procurement?
How much time do we have? There's so many different types of risks. Let's start. Reputational risk, supply chain disruption risk, the risk of another pandemic, the risk of government disruption. Conrad, your turn.
The financial viability, cyber, privacy, labor concerns, there's such a growing list of regulatory risks and concerns, and I think that's just going to keep going. Some of those are overlapping with other sort of supply chain and business risks that we've already been tracking on, but some of them bring new concerns that, even in different regions around the world. Europe's been a lot more focused on sustainability and maybe modern slavery. Australia and the UK have been ahead of everybody else. So, but this is going to push priorities around to everybody.
It's interesting about labor. So in labor, one risk is that lack of qualified labor, which wouldn't allow companies to propel at the different level of economic and technological advancements. But also equally the risk of unskilled, low-qualified labor, because that actually can hit differently in different industries. Maybe not as technological advancement, but bus school drivers, hotels, and restaurants, right? Also, the element within labor of a gig economy. Gig economy has been rising up and up and up. Companies are struggling with finding qualified full-time resources, and people often just don't want to commit to full-time job anymore and want to stay in consulting gigs. So this all represents risks if the companies don't think about them in advance.
Interesting one on labor, Natasha. I think it's very true what you said, the changes to the labor force. What do you see procurement playing a role then in mitigating sort of labor risks? That's not usually a procurement domain. I can see a relationship there linked to, managing third parties and contractors, etc. But do you see any other areas procurement can help with that?
What I see is procurement is branching a lot in bringing people in procurement from finance, from internal audit, from security, and from other areas. I also, in conversations with a couple of my former peers, I see a growing tendency of growing the talent from within versus relying on bringing from outside. And while people may be lacking length of experience, they at least growing from within by just exploring various areas within procurement trade.
Cool. So I think labor risks is sort of just one of that long list that you and Conrad started to rattle off. So that's a lot of risks. Where do procurement professionals even start? How do you decide what to focus on? How do you go about it? Conrad, do you got a view?
Well, I mean, it's fairly easy to go online and just start running AI surveys and come up with a lengthy list of what risks are out there. But each business has its own unique risks that kind of come about based on what business they're doing, as well as where they are in their business life cycle and what's happening inside the vertical industry and the competitive landscape and the kind of the maturity of their business. So there's a bunch of things that are unique here. You can't just go cookie cutter what somebody else is doing. You really need to understand your own business, and you need to start. First off, you need to kind of stand up and get out of your office or cubicle or Zoom room and go talk to people in your business. This isn't something that procurement can do on their own. Well, Natasha, I think you've got some great examples just directly from your last role that'd be really helpful here.
Yeah, it's addressing the risk is one of the best way for leaders to switch from functional mentality to enterprise mentality, because you can't determine the risk on your own. If procurement just simply cannot pursue the risk that it determines to be the most important. You have to partner with legal, you have to partner with tech, you have to partner with internal audit, we have to partner with finance, because whichever areas of risks you're going after, they have to be funded, be supported by legal, highlighted by internal audit, and they often make it to the board. And you very often need tech partnership with tech, because implementation and integration of the riskiest areas in the enterprise will require tech resources. But I think it's very important for this group to also determine which risks are the riskiest, because it actually almost doesn't matter how big your company is. You can have very risky propositions, for example, in an area of working with contingent workforce, just as the large enterprise. Maybe the number of risks can be the same, the depth and the seriousness of the risks can be different. So you jointly have to determine which risks are the riskiest. And then you have to jointly agree which risks you're going after. Very often enterprises make conscious choice that, yes, we recognize the risk, we understand potential consequences, we recognize the impact it can make, we'll keep this risk untouched for now because we have to focus somewhere else. And it may cause frustration for procurement people, but this is where we should curb their own procurement enthusiasm and care more about enterprises. So risks exist always. More often than not, there are more risk areas than an organization can handle at once. And for as long as the jointly organization makes a conscious choice of not pursuing certain risks and only going after the riskiest risks, then that is a plausible approach.
So I think this is a really interesting time to kind of stop and think about the opportunity that this provides procurement leaders, right? Because particularly on the indirect side, I'd just say supply chain leaders have always been involved in the risk management of the supply, like supply assurance, things like that. But over the last 15, 20 years, for sure, there's been this transition of significant risk coming in on the indirect side that need to be addressed. And a bunch of stakeholders are working on it. And in the early stages of that, procurement leaders who are sort of hot potatoing, like, hey, that's IT, or that's, it's late because of them, or we are in a unique role in procurement where we can be the leaders that bring it all together. And how cool is that when you can step up as a leader, it really much elevate your leadership and your visibility and even your appreciation, right? Because most of these other leaders also want somebody to step in and help lead through the process, both, operationally and kind of bring the organization together from a collaboration perspective. I think it's really huge. And while it's daunting and a little bit scary because it isn't typical CPO sort of focus and activity, it really opens the door for somebody to grow their career and grow their influence across the organization, because I believe it will be welcomed as long as you know how to sort of lead in this space and not get it in and try and take over everybody's sandbox here. This is a collaboration leadership role for the most part, not I'm in charge of cyber risk now, right? The CISO is going to do that. All these different risk areas in general have a subject matter expert leader organization that's going to be doing a lot of the real deep, the deep work here.
I think that's a great reframing, Conrad. I think you're saying reframe risk management in procurement. I think a lot of organizations see it as a burden. A lot of procurement teams see it as a burden today to seeing it as more of an opportunity, right? Which I think is really powerful kind of reframing concept. But how do you do that? Because very often procurement will be asked to sort of do the operational side of risk management, right? Ask suppliers all different questions, assess all the suppliers for risk, quantify that somehow, generate some kind of reporting off the back of that. So there's a lot of work that happens. Yet the policy around what those risks are, how they're documented, which risks you should prioritize, etc., as Natasha was saying, is really set by other people in the business, other teams in the business. And often I've seen those teams aren't even aligned. So you might have a team that's focused on cybersecurity and GDPR type of risks, for example, whereas you go somewhere else, you have another team that's focused on.
I think for me personally, because I lived through this, the first step is to, get out of denial. Like, this is going to go down. It's going to slow down. Something else is going to happen. I don't need to own this. It's the delays that it brings into the process are other people's. So get out of denial and then just step up and lead. I don't think that there is any of these other leaders who are in a position to be the center leader role of this process. They all see that they don't all see it maybe, but they have their own risk area, but nobody else is in that position that can see all the risk areas. And none of them either are in a position to represent the stakeholder, the requester, and the business in a way that we're kind of like the voice of the customer and the voice of these risk teams. Like, it all comes together on both sides right in procurement. So it's ours to take. I don't think it requires a tremendous amount of maneuvering, as long as you're not trying to take over those underlying policies. Like, I'm the boss of risk now, so I'm going to set these policies. You absolutely will be in an influence role where you look at all of these things coming together and you add up all of the service levels and you realize that business is going to come to a screeching halt next week when everybody on the risk side gets everything they want, because all they want is to have unlimited risk evaluations. And I mean, that's unfair, but on the extreme side of that. So it puts us in a great situation, and it'll put the procurement leader in a place. And I think Natasha experienced this, personally, where you're up with the most senior leaders of the organization. They all care very deeply about this risk, and none of these other individuals are in a place where they can be the voice of all of that to the leadership.
Yeah. I think that what's happening today in LA is a great representation of miscalculating the risks. Because not to make it a political statement, but just pure facts, right? We'll really see evidences. They are published everywhere. That 3, 4, 5 months ago, people were ringing the bell and they were highlighting the fact that LA is not ready for massive fires, but fires are happening there every year. Because it's a winter season, people are kind of like, maybe just let it slide. But today's day 7. There are 8 fires. Only one fire, Palisades, killed 227,000 acres and burned 9,000 structures. As of today, 17 lives lost. And it's a massive disruption. The preliminary estimates, it's $50 billion damage and expense that's worth of destruction. People were ringing the bell. Someone had to pay attention, and for some or other reasons, decided not to. In fact, defunded the fire department. The fire hydrant didn't have enough water, even though California had plenty of snow in the past 2 years. So technically, the state could have been prepared, but didn't get prepared.
This is really an interesting one, because the people that do risk professionally, insurance companies, actually started pulling out because they saw this risk, right? So they started, not insuring properties in some of these higher risk areas, which should have, that's sort of the final canary in the coal mine that could have said, hey, the people that really understand risk and really do this for a living with a whole bunch of money to lose are making decisions that are different than maybe the government in terms of prioritizing. Yeah.
It's almost like the question is just not how to highlight the risk, but how to make your voice heard. And I think the role of procurement folks here is to build as strong partnership and collaboration across other functional leaders as possible. And frankly, I think we discussed it in one of our earlier episodes. Mainly, the role of a chief procurement officer is to build alliances across organizations, because CPOs usually have very small budget. Their budget is salaries of their team, training classes, and maybe a couple of conferences a year and traveling expenses. But they help the companies to manage billions and billions of dollars, right? And it's not their money, it's the money that belongs to their stakeholders. So how do they make their voice heard? And how do they create an environment where what they say or what they predict or what they call attention to, that it's paid attention to, right? And I think very important factor is, more than any other leaders, chief procurement officers have to, or any procurement people have to wear enterprise hat versus a functional hat, because that's how they will demonstrate they care for the enterprise versus just for their function.
I think that caring for the enterprise is what gives you the voice at the senior level. Natasha, I don't know if you have some examples that you're comfortable sharing most recently, but have you seen senior leadership actually say they don't care about risk, or that they just bring in a balance because maybe they have a broader view of risk than you're putting on the table?
I think it's less about not caring, it's more about prioritization, right? So, because if you have an enterprise that have a buy side, a sell side, that is consumer facing, that is business facing, that has supply chain distribution, that has supply chain and distributions of a structure, and that has big presence and the renowned brand. In many of those instances, you're facing too many risks that you can attend to at once. So it's more what we discussed earlier, which risks are the riskiest and how do you properly prioritize it. But
I would guess being the signal to the leadership team of even one pillar of those potential risks is greatly appreciated, right? Because they're in there now trying to understand all the risks. And the other thing I would guess is you just don't show up to the executive leadership with a bunch of emotional statements around risk. You actually come in with data and information that helps them make a decision of how to balance those risks across the other risks that they're trying to work with, right? So we need to get prepared and show up at a leadership level explaining how we look at the risk, the priority, and what the data says about what should be at least considered in that prioritization discussion.
Absolutely. 100% agree. And what's interesting, indirect procurement usually gets attention because of just sheer number of suppliers. Because if organization has both direct and indirect, the number of suppliers in indirect is usually tenfold than in direct space. Zach, would you agree? Because you see it across many clients, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Not just a longer line of suppliers, but also just a huge diversity of different products and services that are being bought, and high spend and low spend, and high risk and low risk. So yeah, I do see that quite often. Yeah.
And each supplier represents risks. But as we started in the beginning, supplier management is just one risk. And I was once with an organization that on our metrics of risks, we have 47 different risks. And it's just the organization was very diversified and played in many different arenas.
And I think, from my experience, Natasha, that's what stumps a lot of procurement functions today, especially with the resources that they've been given, is they're looking at all these risks, and maybe they do have relationships across the business, but they have so many different risk domains, so many different risks to manage, and they're trying to find ways to streamline that and get a process that allows them to have a proportional response to the risk, but also address all those different risks that are identified in the supply chain. And very often where I've seen these sorts of processes, these risk assessment processes get quite complicated and fail. And so often organizations need to go back to square one and just pick a few risk domains to start with. So even though, their assessment might flag 40 odd different risks, they need to measure. If you're not managing your risks now, start with just 4. Try and get those 4 stakeholders aligned, try and get them on one framework, one process, and then slowly try and convince the other domains, risk areas of the business to sort of add themselves on. But Conrad, I want to ask you, like from a framework point of view, how should organizations go about setting up, a risk management sub-function or capability, if you like?
Well, there's a number. I mean, how you set up the team would be one thing. The framework I like to think about and what we built into our tool is very simple. So 4 steps, and I'll bring them up a little bit as we go through the rest of the conversation as well. But define, measure, manage, and monitor. These four key steps. And most of what we've been talking about so far are the define, right? Like understand what the risks are, figure out what the priorities are. I'd say that's maybe half or 80% of what define needs to be. The other piece of define that we're not talking about yet but I think it's fairly obvious, hopefully to a lot of people, although I think we fail to do it, which is okay, these are risks that matter in the business. Where do those risks show up across our supply base? Because we're talking about indirect now, and it could be 3,000, it could be 30,000, it could be 300,000 suppliers on the indirect side. It is impossible to manage a risk management program across tens of thousands of suppliers. You can have the program, but you can't go into every single one of those suppliers, even with an automated process, and hope to do anything, right? So, these are the risks from a definition perspective, and then where do those risks manifest themselves in the business? So you're kind of cutting it 2 dimensions. What risks matter? Prioritize, and then Natasha talks a lot about commitment. And then also, okay, where are they that we need to go do something about them? That's the define step. But I think having a bit of a framework and a plan, define, measure, manage, and monitor is going to be tremendously helpful.
Are you saying, Conrad, we should accept the level of a gap in the risk awareness? Because like you said, if you have 10,000 suppliers, you're simply not going to be able to measure risk across all of them. So will procurement teams always have a level of the supply chain that they probably don't have as much risk insight into? Or should procurement teams be aiming for, complete visibility, awareness of risks across all suppliers? Maybe this is something a lot of procurement teams struggle to.
Well, I think you used the word awareness, Zach. I would say the single biggest failure I see, and I'm talking to, dozens of companies every month, probably more like a dozen a week right now. And the biggest thing most organizations are doing is they go through this questionnaire process, and they're getting visibility to risk. And you can do these questionnaires across a really broad set of your suppliers if you want to, but it brings back all of this data. And now you're aware of a risk, and your response to that I see in most organizations is, okay, go see if the business is aware that this risk exists and see if they're okay with it. And many organizations actually implement this sign-off process. Like, hey, Zach, you're in the business, you're in marketing, the supplier looks like this is a risk. Is this okay with you? I see 100% acceptance by the business of the risk that the procurement team says, hey, there's a risk here. Okay, that's fine. Let's go. We need to go. Let's do the business. Nobody's actually going beyond the awareness or the visibility of that risk. Nobody's not fair, but that's the biggest single failure I see in building out a program like this. And I think that's simply because you're trying to boil the ocean. You're saying, hey, let's go look at risk across maybe all of these risks across all of these suppliers. And then think back to the framework. Define, measure, I can kind of do that, but then you get to manage. And how do you actually manage risk across more than dozens or hundreds of suppliers in a really meaningful way? Now this is going to start taking significant human resources to go talk to these suppliers, work with the suppliers, meet with them regularly, give them feedback. It starts to get very expensive from a resource perspective, so I can see why it stops right there. But if you don't go beyond visibility and awareness, I actually think you're doing your organization a bit of a disservice, because it's kind of like what we're talking about in California. You know there's a problem and you don't do something about it. It is very negligent at that point. Like, it's terrible.
Why do you think that is, Natasha? Why do you think procurement teams aren't great at the managing risk part, and all focused on the measuring and identifying risk part?
I think I wouldn't hold it against procurement teams. I think it's because there's a saying, the energy flows where the mind goes. And you can replace the energy with funding, right? And if the mind of the enterprises does not go into investing into risky areas, procurement people can ring the bell all day long. If this is not becoming a priority for the CEO, for the board, for the community the company serves, then it can actually go unnoticed, right? And public companies are very often driven by quarterly earnings, and investment into risks, addressing the risks. It's a very lengthy commitment, and it's very expensive commitment. What COVID demonstrated, that if you don't diversify your production, in some period of time, your stores will not have inventory. But 6 months later, you're going to have too much inventory in hands, and you will have to start into discounting a lot of products, because everything what got stuck in Asia during COVID for 16, 18, 20 weeks came back much later, and that was already off season. And if it's an apparel, then you have to start discounting. So the question is, why do we produce everything in one region? Why are we not present in another region? And it's like, it'll take us 10 years before another region will get to that level of efficiency to produce what's produced in Asia. But in order to rest in a shadow today, in a shade today, you had to plant the tree 10 years ago, right? Let's plant the tree now. So 10 years from now, you can have diversified supply chain. But are the companies willing to invest today into what will bring the benefits 10 years from now? The CEO will be different, the CFO will be different. Like, are we getting into the area who gets credit for the great results? So there's a lot about long-term planning, long-term commitment to the business success versus what is popular which investment is popular on the short term. Am I too brutal, Conrad?
Well, I think it's totally fair, but I guess there's always going to be this case in procurement and even in risk where there's an argument to put more there, right? So there could be super negligent, like we're not doing anything. I don't think that that's generally the situation. Or you could say there is this super overabundance of resources being applied into this space. And I would say that's almost never happening as well. So it's kind of in this middle where you're saying, well, what trade-offs are we having to make, right? So that comes back to, like, in this definition phase, if it's let's say it's underfunded or funded at a lower level than we think, we still need to, it's something, right? It's something. And so that means that we go back to the define phase and we say, well, with this budget, what can we apply through the full cycle here? Because if we just go, okay, well, with this budget, I can go define, measure, but I run out of resources to continue that process into the manage and monitor because I didn't get funded. I think you've got to go back and change the scope of what you're actually saying. Our program is this then. If it's funded at this level, then this is our risk management program, but we can still do something. And my statement, what I was trying to say before, is this idea of doing kind of stopping after awareness and not moving forward is kind of a problem. It's better to focus more and carry that focused effort through manage and mitigation and monitor, right? To go through the rest of that and make a difference and move the needle than it is to have really broad awareness of those risks. That's what I would say. So I would say more, we can work with some level of budget if you'll give it to us, to go manage risk, but don't expect the total potential possible risk management program with a smaller budget. We're going to change the scope of what that looks like and carry it through and do it really well.
Yeah, that's very sound advice, I think, Conrad. Yeah, I guess funding is part and parcel of risk management, right? And I guess you need to look at that. You need to look at the resources you've got that have the time to go and do the hard work of speaking to suppliers, mitigating the risks, either contractually or by putting arrangements in place, etc. And yeah, that takes time. And very often procurement teams are being asked to do third-party risk, but not being given any additional resource or funding.
Let me also add, I don't think that it's just procurement budget here, right? Because it's probably not appropriate for procurement to be the leader in the room with a supplier that's an IT supplier and be doing all of the supplier management and kind of mandating this risk stuff. That needs to be a partnership. And the commitment Natasha always talks about here isn't just procurement budget commitment, it's the business as well. Like, you're going through this in partnership down these different channels, and carrying it all the way through to, moving the needle and making a difference.
Yeah, and that underlines...
Like the enterprise, a business cannot have 20 burning platforms. So you determine that there are 20 risks, right? But he can't address all 20. So which risks are determined to be burning platforms? So for everyone to get behind them. And as Conrad said, that it may not be like a big bang, but what are the incremental steps can be made in a couple of directions to make enterprise safer?
I think it's better to do less in this case, honestly, than too much. Like, err on the side of biting off less than being really, optimistic about what you can do, particularly if you haven't done this before end to end, because there are a lot more cost and time investments that are needed in the manage and monitor side. And once you've kind of got that cycle figured out and you know how it's going to work, then go back and bite off a little bit more and kind of add it into the flow based on what the priorities are.
Yeah. So definitely underlines that point around enterprise risk. Consult the business, speak to your peers, understand what risks are important to them, and sort of be business-driven, business-led when it comes to setting up your risk framework. Does that sound fair? Cool.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So I want to go back, Natasha, you were talking about... Sorry.
No, I wanted to say it's endless pursuit for business happiness.
Yeah.
Addressing the risks.
Well, I think we brought a realistic dimension to risk management here, So I think that's going to be very useful for a lot of our listeners. But I want to go back, Natasha, you were talking about sort of the fires in California, and maybe I want to talk a little bit about risks again, specific risks. Last time we talked a lot about technological and talent aspects of procurement. And so today, maybe we focus on a few other sort of risk topics or risk domains. I've got here supply chain disruption. We've got inflation and commodity price volatility. And then, of course, we've got the all-important reputation and brand risk. So maybe starting off with that supply chain disruption risk, which we emphasized was a big one. It's going to be a big one in 2025. What do you see? How should organizations be positioning themselves to deal with those disruptions?
I'd say that wherever business is, they have to be very practical, with eyes wide open on assessing how geopolitical tensions and various aspects of whether it's commodity pricing, whether it's climate change impact, whether it's sustainability aspects, whether it's regionalization trends, how it will impact their own business. All right. I am sure that there are a lot of CEOs that are sitting right now and thinking, okay, that if the tariffs with China really hit, where is going to be our price point? And how it's going to impact our consumers. And I really hope that all procurement people at the same time sitting and thinking, how can we bring the price down? Do we change the providers? Do we keep the providers and ask them to ship from or produce on different location? Do we change the specs of our products? Can we replace the product? Can we eliminate the product, or can we produce more of it? Can we build an alliance with another firm that buys very similar thing but is a non-competitive business with us? So it almost like if procurement people be very open-minded and very tuned in on everything what's happening in the world, then at the time when the CEO is thinking about the impact on the customer and on the consumer and the pricing policies, that the procurement people are thinking about what can we do from the sourcing practices, cost perspective, channels, materials, alliances, everything what is under their control. Not until they're asked, but being proactive, building proactive vision on how can they leverage their proactive thinking and almost like being first in the market to bend the curve that is about to hit everyone. It's the same if you are in hospitality business and you rely on some, or in the farming business and you rely on some undocumented resources, how can you as a procurement organization can help? Can you help your firm to build other labor segments? And from where? Do you bring retirees back to work, right? Do you have special programs for like juniors and seniors in high schools? Can we create the second chance for in-prison population? There are many aspects that creative procurement people, there are many factors that creative procurement people can start thinking about how to avoid something that is coming up.
It's funny while you're talking, Natasha, I was thinking, and sorry, this keeps coming back to the fires, but it's top of mind. Like we're kind of pointing fingers at the government, like they should have done something, they should have known something. This supply chain disruption risk is one that if you look at the metrics out there right now, right, there's a ton of tensions, there's political issues, Trump's coming into office, all of these governments that have changed over. There's a lot of science out there that indicates that these extreme weather events, like what is driving the issue in California right now, these are increasing. This is like 23% increase in climate-related disruptions in supply chain. As people are shifting away from China, that's creating other tensions that are more regional. Like we know things are happening here, so waiting for something bad to happen and being reactive, which I think is like really key behind what Natasha's saying, is not acceptable. It's time to predict and understand these things are coming, and procurement can step up and start leading these conversations.
And then what about inflation and commodity price volatility then? Is it similar type of approach? If we look at some of the geopolitical tensions and sort of the supply chain disruptions that we're expecting in the year, there are a number of different categories that are going to increase in costs. So is it managed in the same way as supply chain?
What do you see, Zach? Because you have customers that buy direct, indirect, and I'm sure that there are some companies that are heavily dependent on this. What do you see there?
I see the way I see it is companies need to be all over their bread and butter, right? So where it's direct and they're buying materials, they're buying commodities, they absolutely need to have access to that data, both in terms of where the prices are today and also be very well read into that category and as to what can happen in the future. So
I also keep coming back to my favorite, crutch, rely on suppliers. Be in constant dialogue with the service providers. Ask them for their perspective because they live and breathe by it. And you just one client for them, but if they have one product or one service that they sell across multiple clients, they pay triple attention to that, right? And they know even better where the wind blows because their entire livelihood depends on it. So don't be in a constant dialogue with your third parties.
Definitely have that line to your top suppliers. You can pick up and ask those questions directly. I think absolutely. I think also do your research, do your reading if you're not already, right? Because a lot has been talked about tariffs and what the Trump administration might do. And there's been some great analysis that's been published, for example, by the Washington Post that talks about what the likely areas of disruption might be for commodity and price risk. And that includes things like steel, iron, aluminum, copper, medical supplies is another big one. And then anything to do with manufacturing batteries and rare earth minerals, etc. So I think you really need to have a good, solid understanding of your supply chain, have a general understanding of all the things that could happen to disrupt that supply chain, rank those in terms of priority or maybe incident likelihood, and then make sure you have strategies in place to mitigate those. So whether that's diversity of supply or, yeah, exactly. So that's how I'd see managing that particular category. Obviously, when that happens, sometimes companies need to absorb a level of cost increases, right? And procurement never gets thanked for when they're able to mitigate that. But that's exactly what procurement teams should be focused on. There. Yeah, well, I think, what about reputation and brand risk then? So in this age of social media, business reputation can be turned on its head, within a day. So we've got a report from Nielsen that shows 73% of global consumers prefer brands committed to sustainability. There's a lot more regulatory pressure being applied by different governments, etc. So what role can procurement play when it comes to managing reputation and brand risk?
I'll just give one quick example from my past life. I once joined the company with a very recognized brand name, and I was just doing a regular procurement due diligence and looked at the marketing spend. We had over 100 providers just providing tchotchkes, something with a company logo on. A teddy bear here, like a pen and pencil here, a notepad, a jacket, something. And so we just did an experiment. We asked all the suppliers to send us which logo they used. So then we took all these examples and we came to the CMO and we say, this is what's happening with your promotional items. Out of 100 suppliers, you have 13 versions of logo. I said, that's your brand dilution. And do you need 100 suppliers if you can actually create one catalog and make it global? And you put the logo there, one logo, and that's how it gets produced. Promotional items is not the largest expense area for any organization. But rest assured, procurement organization, by just making very, very fact-based analysis and not creating any fuss about this, the proliferation of suppliers, and we didn't even emphasize on cost. We just talk about with marketing about what's important to marketing, brand integrity, and focus on the quality of brand. Right? That's it. So, and after that, we work with marketing on every aspect of their business, including the most critical, the most strategic, the most sensitive, right? That's it. So again, just don't think procurement, don't have procurement thoughts. And I think we spoke about it our earlier episodes. We have to stop speaking procurement across organization. We have to understand what's important to them and speak their language. And that's just a very simple example of how you get to the hearts of stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that's come out across.
So, sorry, Zach. Risk management to me is supplier management, right? You're doing supplier management, and risk is part of what you're doing in managing these suppliers. And what's behind effective supplier management is setting clear expectations and holding suppliers accountable. And those expectations, like Natasha's giving an example of, many of those expectations come from the business. Like, you use the logo that is in our brand book. You don't use a different one. And if you aren't following the instructions, you're automatically really disqualifying yourself from doing business down the road. And this applies across so many places. So understanding the policies and being really disciplined as an organization about communicating those policies and holding suppliers accountable to those policies is the very best way to keep suppliers behaving inside the rails that preserve our organization's brand and reputation and integrity, right? There's the business cares about these things, and like these other risk areas, when you take an example like Natasha's talking about, the business, speak to them in their language. This is the risk. This is what's happening. It's a big deal. Sadly, and I'm not poking on that. That the company Natasha's talking about there, because I think we all do this. Procurement probably dropped the ball there. I mean, you could say, well, marketing dropped the ball because they didn't manage those suppliers really well. But we're responsible to help go manage all these things, set the expectations.
I don't know. I always defend my procurement professionals. Yeah. But great conversation, and the conversation about risks. Maybe we should go back to it, like maybe 6 months from now, and see, especially like we'll be 6 months in Trump presidency, and see if risks have changed.
Yeah. I think also this conversation has really underscored sort of our previous discussions around the importance of procurement, thinking of the enterprise, building stakeholder relationships. Procurement being ultimately a support function means it really needs to be business-led, and risks is one of the number one areas you should make sure it's business-led and make sure you have the business in your strategy. Yeah, when you're creating,
we're brokering those relationships, right? So understanding all those bits and pieces, setting clear expectations, and holding people accountable. Like this is a really big part of who we are and what we need to execute.
And I like that way of thinking. A broker, basically, of relationships between the business and the external market. That's a great, I think, way to frame it. So thanks both, Natasha, Conrad. I think we've learned quite a lot in this session. Definitely, we're going to touch on a lot of these topics in future episodes. Some of the key lessons that we've taken away. What are we taking away? We said partner with stakeholders, right? Think about risks for the entire enterprise. Don't just think about supply chain or procurement. Do it together with the business. Reframe risk management from something that's administrative and is a burden to a real opportunity for procurement leaders to step up and engage the business and show that they're adding value proactively. We also said, don't just identify the risks, make sure you manage the risks. And to that end, if it means you need to identify less risks, but you're able to manage some risks better in that case, then do that. So work with the resources you have. And I think, ultimately procurement has a responsibility to push this up the agenda, and it's a real great opportunity for procurement to do more, actually, even though I understand a lot of procurement teams are struggling with this as a new sort of ask from a lot of businesses. So is that good at summarizing most of the points? I get everything there.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks, Natasha, Conrad, as ever.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks for leading us through a conversation. We'll meet soon.
See you in the next episode.